In this lecture, we're going to connect Google Sheets to the ChatGPT API in Zapier. This is going to be a three-step zap with the ChatGPT API sandwiched between Google Sheets. The reason for this setup is that we'll pull the data we already have in Google Sheets from the previous lecture, then we'll call on the ChatGPT API to work its magic and transform tweets into haiku poems. And finally, we'll put all of that data back into our Google Sheet. I'll explain everything in detail as we build it together, and I'll pay special attention to the ChatGPT API implementation. So let's pick up where we left off in the last lecture, right here in our Zapier dashboard. We can see our previously created zap here, which was one Twitter to Google Sheets. Now, as before, let's start by clicking the Create Zap button in the top left corner. And first, once you're here, is that we'll need to define our trigger application and event. And since the ChatGPT API will be sandwiched between Google Sheets, the first application that we'll want to find and select is, of course, Google Sheets. So you'll want to find it. Once you've found it, simply select it. And now we can define the trigger event for Google Sheets. This trigger event will kickstart the specific zap that we're creating. And in our case for our project, what we'll want to choose as our trigger event is new spreadsheet row, which we can see gets triggered when a new row is added to the bottom of a spreadsheet. With that selected, we can go ahead and click Continue. Now, you should have already connected your Google Sheets account in the previous lecture. If you did, you'll see your account connected like mine. If not, or if you don't see it for some reason, please connect it when prompted to do so by Zapier. It's a simple one-click process. But once you've got your account connected, you can go ahead and click Continue. Now, let's select the spreadsheet that we want to work with, and this is the one that we created initially at the start of this section and have been working with, and that is Generate Replies. So you'll want to find that, and once you've found it, select it. And then we'll want to choose the specific worksheet within that Google Sheet that we want to work with for our first part of our zap, and that is the Tweets worksheet in that spreadsheet. And once you have selected the spreadsheet and worksheet, you can then select Continue. Zapier will now let us test everything up to this point. I always recommend testing your automations at every opportunity, so let's click Test Trigger. And if everything is working correctly, you should see the data from the Google Sheet appear as we do. So we can see we have the first column, which has the text data from the tweet, and we can see that in the second column we have the link to that specific tweet. And if we switch back to the Google Sheet for one moment, we'll see that it's the same there. So in the second row we have the tweet text and we have the tweet link. So we know that's working correctly. With that set, we can now go back to Zapier and click Continue. That wraps up the first part of our three-step zap. Now we're going to define the action, which is what happens after the trigger event. Remember, the trigger event for this zap is a new row of data in our Google Sheet. So the application we now want to search for and select is ChatGPT. So once you've found it, select it. Just like with other applications, we first need to define its event before we can configure all of the other settings. So from the drop-down, the event that you'll want to select is Conversation. And we can see that enables us to send a chat to OpenAI and generate a completion, storing the message as we go. So make sure that the event is set to Conversation because we want to turn our tweet text into haiku poems. So once you've done that and selected it, click Continue. At this point, you'll be asked to connect your API account to Zapier. If you didn't know already, OpenAI is the company behind ChatGPT, and connecting OpenAI and Zapier is a simple one-click process. It's similar to every other app when connecting it in Zapier. Now I've already connected my account, as you can see, so there's no connection request for me. But once you get that pop-up, please connect your account. And then after connecting ChatGPT or OpenAI to Zapier, you'll then be asked to enter your OpenAI API key. So let me show you how to find that if you need it and if you need help on where to find it. So to get your OpenAI API key, what you'll want to do is switch over to OpenAI and log into your account. You should be familiar with this dashboard if you went through the setup lecture with me in the first section. So once you're here, what you'll want to do is select your username in the top right, and then you'll want to select View API Keys. And once you've landed on the API Keys page, then select Create New Secret Key. And you'll first be asked if you want to name your secret key. And just for testing purposes, I'll name it Zapier Test and click Create New Secret Key. Now remember, never to share the API key that we can see that has just got generated with others. If you do, they could use your allowance, which is of course something we don't want to happen. Now I'm going to delete this key later, so I'm not worried about that. But once your key is generated, please click to copy it and keep it somewhere safe for later use. Because after you copy the key and you click Done, you won't be able to view it again. Now, if you ever forget your API key, you'll have to generate a new one and then update any tools, for example, Zapier, that are using it. Now that we've covered that, there's one more thing that I want to show you while we're still here in OpenAI. So let's go to the usage page along the left-hand side menu. And now I want to say, and it's something that I suggest, is that you create a new OpenAI account if you have an old one, because you'll get a free trial period for using the API. Otherwise, you'll have to pay for access like I do. And it's on this page where you'll be able to keep track of your usage. That said, if you do create a paid account, you can cap the billing, which I've done. And you can do that under the billing page again on the left-hand side, and then click Usage Limits. And from here, you'll be able to set soft and hard limits to control your spending while using a paid plan. But like I said, if you sign up for a new account, you'll gain free access, so a free trial, to use the API key. But once you've created your API key and you've copied it like I showed, we can head back to Zapier. And of course, I don't have to enter it, but you'll be prompted to enter your API key, which you can then paste in and connect your account. Then after connecting OpenAI to Zapier, you can click Continue. In this part, we're going to now define the action for this application, which is of course ChatGPT. This means we'll set how ChatGPT responds to the input we give it, and of course defining that input is crucial. And we're going to dive into all of the details here, starting from the top and working our way through each setting, because I want to make sure that you understand everything. That is of course the purpose of this course, working with OpenAI and ChatGPT. So the first thing that we'll want to edit and work with is user message, which you can see is the first option. So you'll want to press into the box and then you'll see a drop-down menu appear. And it's this setting which determines the specific variable that we'll feed as input to ChatGPT. It'll be the most recent row of data if you have a large Google sheet of tweets. We of course have one. You can see it here. It's the tweet variable. So I'm going to go ahead and select the tweet text data. And as quickly as that, we have defined the user message for ChatGPT. And this variable will update itself whenever a new row appears at the bottom of our Google Sheet. I now want to move on to model. Now, don't worry, we're going to come back to assistant instructions, assistant name, and username in just a moment. But right now, let's go to model and click into the box and then select the model tab. Because it's here where we'll be able to see the models that are available to us. And in our case, what we'll want to do is make sure that GPT 3.5 Turbo is selected. That's the model used by ChatGPT for most users at the moment. Now there are of course several models under OpenAI, as you saw in the drop-down menu, and the one we're using, GPT 3.5 Turbo, is just one of them. However, it's perhaps one of the most capable that most people currently have access to. But as new models come out, or if anything changes, I will update the project resources lecture to guide you. But the model that we're using, GPT 3.5 Turbo, is the one you must select, and it's the one that sits in between GPT-3 and GPT-4, so it's extremely competent, and best of all, it's optimized for chat. And it's a lot more capable than the model before that many people were using, which was Text DaVinci 003. Now with the model selected, we can move on to temperature, which is just below model. And we're going to leave this set to the default value of 1. So if it's not set to 1, please change it to 1 that you see here, so 1.0. But even though we're leaving it set to default, I want to explain what it means because it's pretty crucial. So in the context of working with the OpenAI API, temperature refers to the setting that controls the creativity and randomness of the output. So you can set low numbers like 0.2 for predictable and conservative outputs. Alternatively, you can set high numbers like 1.8 for creative and unpredictable outputs. But in a nutshell, to kind of really understand this, a higher temperature results in a more adventurous output, while a low temperature means the model will be more cautious. So this setting really depends on your goals when using OpenAI. But for our project, we'll set it to 1, which is a middle of the road setting. So we have creativity, but we also have conservativeness as well. And with that set, we can now go back up and go through the other settings that we initially skipped. So username, assistant name, and assistant instructions. So I'll first start with assistant instructions, which you can see here. Now, if you went through the section on prompt engineering, this will look a little familiar because you'll notice the prompt that we create, how it resembles the role prompt that was discussed in that section. So let me edit assistant instructions. I'm going to write in the specific instruction that I want to enter and create and call the API with, and then I'll explain the reason why I created it the way I have. So I'm going to enter, you are a poet, convert user message into a haiku poem. 5 syllables on line 1, 7 syllables on line 2, and 5 syllables again on line 3. And I'll just edit the bit here, so 5 syllables on line 1, 7 syllables on line 2, and 5 syllables on line 3, and then we can enter a full stop. Now let me explain why I created the assistant instruction in this way. So to begin, I entered this because we are, of course, creating haiku poems, and I want to nudge the model to act poetically. Hence I enter, you are a poet, thus producing a better output. So we define the role we want the model to take, and then we have the action we want it to perform. So we want it to convert user message into a haiku poem. And going further, we provide it with some context on the structure of haiku poems. And they have 5 syllables on line 1, 7 syllables on line 2, and 5 again on line 3. I'm not going to delve deeper into role prompt engineering here, since we're working on our project. But if you skip that section, I recommend going back and checking it out. It's going to be very helpful for you. But with the assistant instructions set, we can now move on. So let's go back to username, which you can see just below user message. And I'm going to leave this set as default to user. You can of course change this if you want, but it refers to you, the user. It's an identifier that allows the API to keep track of user conversations, personalizing responses based on previous interactions. Next up, we have assistant name. Like the username, I'll leave this set to default, which is assistant. Of course, as before with username, you can change this too, but it refers to the model responding. So, you could give it a more personal name, but be assured it won't affect the generated responses. It's just a way to make them more unique. Now, the other settings, let's discuss them. So we have top P, which we'll leave set as 1 to default. I won't discuss that too much here. That's for another section in this course. But for this project, make sure that it's set to 1. And then we have memory key. And I will explain that while we're here. Now we're going to leave it set to blank, but to briefly explain, this is where you can define a piece of information for the model to remember throughout the interactions. So if you are having a long conversation thread, it'll remember this specific data that is defined here. For instance, you could provide an email address or name as a memory key, so it's another way to personalize outputs. But once you've done as I've done, you can then go ahead and click continue. Now we'll be able to test everything up to this point. But before we test, let's take a look at what the call to the API will look like. So we can see that we have the assistant name, which we left as default to assistant, and the specific model that we selected, which was GPT 3.5 Turbo. And then we can see how the system message and the temperature are defined. So we can see the system message that you are a poet, convert username into haiku poem, and then we give some context. And then we can see the temperature setting. We can also see the user message, which is the tweet text. And this is the text that we want to convert into a haiku poem. What I'm going to do now is click Test Action. And if everything is set up correctly, it'll call the OpenAI API using our unique API key. And within moments, we'll see a response from the API in Zapier. So let me walk you through the response, i.e. the reply from the ChatGPT API. So first off, under response, which we can see here, we have the role which is set to assistant, and that was by default. And next, we come to the most crucial part, which is the content that it returned. And as you can see, it has created a haiku poem from the tweet as requested. It's truly amazing to start working with OpenAI on projects like this and seeing their output. Moving further down, we can also see if the request was timed out or not. In our case, it wasn't. This will be set to true if the request took too long, meaning it was unsuccessful. Then moving further down, we have other settings such as history context. And here you'll see tokens used and tokens remaining. This is something I created a specific lecture on in the FAQ section at the end of this course. And tokens are something extremely crucial, and we'll discuss them more in another project, but I just wanted to introduce the term while you're here in this project, in this section. But basically, it's a way to track API usage, and when we make a call to the API, our actual text is broken down into tokens. And a letter is a token, a punctuation, a grammar, and you'll be able to see that once we start working directly with the API, how tokens are actually created and tracked. I've linked a few resources which will help you to visualize them as well. So in the course resources in the first section, I've linked to the tokenizer calculator on the OpenAI website, where you can enter a piece of text and see how it's broken down into tokens. But if you want a quick introduction and a quick summary of how tokens work and what they are, more specifically, I've created a lecture in the FAQ section at the end of this course, which you can just skip ahead to and review and then come back as well if you want to. But yeah, tokens, we're going to go over that in other projects as well, but I just wanted to introduce the term here, so it's not something new. when we start working more clearly with them. But that's everything about setting up the OpenAI API and working with it. As you can see, it was pretty easy, so great job. What we can now do is click Close to close the settings for this Zap, part of this larger automation. With that closed, we have now created the first two steps, so let's add the final one. And the last step was to include Google Sheets again. Remember how I mentioned earlier that the OpenAI API will be sandwiched between Google Sheets? Well, now we're creating the final part. So you can go ahead and click the plus icon to add another application. And once you've done that, what you'll want to do is search for and select Google Sheets. As before, and as with all the other applications, the first thing that we'll need to do is pick an event. This time, the event that we will want to choose is Create Spreadsheet Row, which we can see here, and it will create a new row in a specific spreadsheet for us. So once you've selected that, click Continue. Now you should have already connected your Google Sheets account if you've got this far in the lecture. If you did, you'll see your account connected like mine. If not, or for some reason it doesn't show up, please connect it. Zapier connects to Google Sheets with just one click. But once your account is connected, you can simply click Continue. Now we can go through and define the specific settings for this step in our Zap. The first thing that we'll want to do is select the drive, so the Google Drive. And in our case, it will be My Google Drive, and it should be similar for you too. So you'll want to select that. And after you've done that, you'll want to select the spreadsheet that we're working with. And in our case, it will be the one we created initially and we've been working with throughout this section, which is Generate Replies. So find and select that. And then the worksheet that we'll want to select this time is the Haku's worksheet. And once you've selected that, you'll see the options fields expand to represent the columns in that specific worksheet. From here, we can begin to map the data throughout the Zap to specific columns in that worksheet in the Google Sheet we created. So let's start from the top and map all the data that we want. So in the tweet column, what I want here is to map the original tweet. So with the drop-down open, what I'm going to do is expand the options for the Google Sheet, and then I'm going to pick the tweet data, which we can see here. Simple as that. I want to do the same for the link column, so we'll open the drop-down, expand the first option, which was from the Google Sheet, and enter the link data so we can map it to that column. And then in the final Haku's column, I want to insert the output from the ChatGPT API call. So with the drop-down menu open, we can select the conversation in ChatGPT, which was in the second step. Then what we'll want to do is find the assistant response message. So if we keep scrolling down towards the bottom, we can see the assistant response message, and that's the variable holding the generated Haku poem. So you'll want to select that. And with those fields populated, we can click Continue. Zapier will then show us a preview of what the output will look like, as we can see here. So we have the data that will be in column A, the data that will be in column B, and the data that will be in column C. So that's great. But as always, I want to run an actual test. So I'm going to click Test Action. And if everything is set up correctly, within moments, the Zap will run within Zapier. So to check if it's worked correctly, let's switch over to our Google Sheet, and then let's click on the Haku's worksheet. And there we should see our data from the Zap. And if we expand the columns, so the tweet column, the link column, and the Haku column, we can see everything that we wanted inside our Google Sheet. So we know that everything is set up correctly. Great work. So what we can do now is switch back to Zapier and wrap up on this lecture. The first thing that I'm going to do is click Close to close these steps. And then I'm going to rename this Zap to something more concise. And I can do that by clicking in the top left, and then I'll rename it to 2.sheets, and then do a little rocket, and then enter ChatGPT, again another little rocket, and sheets again. Of course, you can rename it something more descriptive if you want to. We're not going to publish this as it would require a premium or free trial account because it has 3 steps, but as you've seen, we can build and test projects without any issues. And with that done, I'll return to the Zapier dashboard. And here you'll see the second part of the larger automation that we're creating. But that's everything for this lecture. I hope you enjoyed following along. In the next lecture, we'll pick up from here again to create another Zap. That new Zap will be part of the larger project that we are, of course, creating to automate replies. So join me in the next lecture where we'll continue building our project.